Dear Void, I have spoken on this channel about how antisemitism is part of Western culture, and I get that many Jews living abroad, especially American Jews, find it a bit hard to believe. I mean, people have lives in the Gola, in diaspora. They were raised there, they went to school with Westerners, they've built careers there with them, and they can't imagine those people being racist or even violent against them. And I get it. And I also don't think that all Westerners are violent anti-Semites. Nor do I think that Jews should abandon the West, although it's good to know that we live at a time when they do have somewhere to go to if they choose to. But I do think it's important that we understand the extent to which anti-Semitism is baked into the cultural background of Western society, because that is the way to educate not just ourselves, but them as well, and make it possible for things to change. You can't fix things if you don't know where the problem lies. And yes, I do think that you Americans, or anyone living in the West, who think that your neighbors, friends, colleagues, and so on, could never be anti-Semitic in any way or think badly of you because of your background, I think you misunderstand the problem and the different ways in which you have experienced the culture you were born into, and they have. And also, I think you don't necessarily understand that it's always been there and has nothing to do with the current war. A few years ago, long before this war, the known anti-Semite John Oliver made a segment in his show about a smaller round of violence between Israel and Hamas. In that case, back then, Hamas fired too many rockets into Israel, and Israel, instead of keeping quiet as we stupidly have done most of the time, decided to strike back. And Oliver made an entire segment about how Jews are evil for retaliating. And his biggest point was that Jews are overreacting because, thanks to Iron Dome, most of Hamas rockets didn't cause any casualties. Now, take a moment to realize what an outrageous thing that is to say. He basically said that attempted murder shouldn't be taken so seriously if the murderer is too incompetent at being a murderer. Have you ever heard of anyone making such an argument in any other case? Ever? Of course not. Because this is a double standard that was invented specifically for Jews. The anti-Semite Oliver was basically saying, so they tried to kill some Jews. Who doesn't do that from time to time? What's the big deal? It's not like they succeeded. Now, Oliver is not representative of all Westerners. He is not what I would call a casual anti-Semite or a cultural anti-Semite. I believe that he is a hardened anti-Semite, a person who actually believes Jews are inferior and evil and should be treated as such. So he's not a great example. But there are those who I 100% believe were not anti-Semitic at all, and did not share John Oliver's evil worldview, but still held anti-Semitic beliefs in spite of themselves, because of the culture in which they grew up. For example, Marlon Brando, one of the all-time best character actors the world has ever seen. He was an amazingly talented actor, and he's my favorite example to give because he was also an amazingly kind person. I don't think you can find anyone who was less of a racist than Brando. This guy was a hippie. This guy was lecturing people about racial misrepresentation in Hollywood movies all the way back in the 70s. He was pretty much alone in talking about it. He was mocked by the stars of the time, like Eastwood, for talking about it. He even refused the Oscar for his role in The Godfather, and he sent a Native American woman in his place to take the opportunity and speak of the plight of the Native Americans and their representation in American movies. And when it comes to Jews, he was a Zionist. He participated in a Zionist play in the 60s and publicly supported Jews and our right for self-determination. And yet, here's a quote of him from a Playboy interview. You've seen every single race besmirched, but you never saw an image of the kike because the Jews were ever so watchful for that, and rightly so, they never allowed it to be shown on screen. He then doubled down when talking to Larry King. Now, he's using a lot of racial slurs here, but I am going to quote a more user-friendly version of his words. He was basically saying, Hollywood is run by Jews. It is owned by the Jews. and they should have a greater sensitivity about the issue of people who are suffering, because they've exploited the minorities. We've seen the minorities being exploited, we've seen everything, but we never saw the Jew, because they knew perfectly well that is where you draw the wagon around. Now, what Brando is trying to say, if you break it down, doesn't sound that bad to a Westerner. The point he was trying to make is that there were Jews in positions of power in Hollywood, and he believed they made sure there wasn't a bad representation of Jews on the big screen. And he felt that they should have used the same influence to also shield other minorities. So that in itself does not sound like an anti-Semitic thing to say, but it is. Remarkably so. Let's break it down. First of all, it's not true that the Jews made sure Jews were not besmirched in Hollywood films. There were plenty of films which portrayed the Jews according to the old stereotypes, greedy, manipulator, self-centered, weak. If you ask ChatGPT for a list of those portrayals, it will give them to you. And this portrayal continued all the way to modern times. In the show Mad Men, for example, in the episode where Israelis come to ask for a campaign for tourism, they are portrayed as pushy, rude, unreasonable, and impatient. They also casted actors that were, let's call it, not conventionally attractive. In a show where everybody was cast in part based on looks, it stood out very clearly. So the Jew has been besmirched repeatedly in Hollywood. The premise is wrong. Also, the responsibility that is being placed on the Jews. The Jews should protect other minorities. Not the Westerners should stop persecuting other minorities. No, the Jews need to protect them. But what makes this take especially racist is the sentence, the Jews control Hollywood. First of all, no they don't. There are plenty of studios that are not owned or controlled by Jewish people. In fact, most of the big studios right now, Disney, Warner Brothers, Paramount, Universal, Sony, none of them are controlled by Jewish people. And they weren't even when Brando made his remarks. In the early days of Hollywood, Jewish immigrants did start a few of the studios, but control passed to the public or different companies in the 40s, the latest. So it's a leftover trope. And yes, there are many Jews in the entertainment business, in both management and as actors and writers and so on. Can we help that we are funnier and more creative than you Gentiles? That doesn't mean that the Jews control Hollywood. Second, the sentence assumes that we are a hive mind. What do you mean, the Jews control? What? Which Jews? What do you think, that if some Jew is the head of a bank, then somehow I must be getting dividends? This is part of the Jews are conspirators trope. And third, when you say Jews own Hollywood, it sounds like there's something nefarious there, like they somehow tricked someone into giving them Hollywood, they stole it. When the reality is that American Jews just worked their asses off and took risks, because in Jewish culture, especially Ashkenazi Jewish culture, you have to excel in everything so that the Gentiles won't have an excuse to kill us. Take for example New Line Cinema. That's the company that produced the Lord of the Rings movies. And it started as a distribution company by Bob Shai, a Jew. And he wanted to pivot into production and took a chance on this little horror script that has been floating around for years called A Nightmare on Elm Street. And to produce that movie, he took a second mortgage on his house. He financed it with his blood. If Nightmare failed, Bob Shai would have been ruined. But Nightmare became a huge hit, a huge iconic horror franchise, and for years they used to say about New Line Cinema that it was the house that Freddy built. So this idea that American Jews didn't earn everything they have and somehow just got it from the Jewish cabal is pure anti-Semitism. So you see why saying the Jews control Hollywood is a racist thing to say. But even when Larry King, another Jewish man, tried to explain it to Brando, Brando was like, no, I love Jews, I support them. Which is funny because you are actually doubling down on your own racism by saying that. If you have a black person in your life, ask them if they like it when people say, I love black people. If they're honest, they'll tell you, it's better than I hate, but it's not good. Because I'm not every black person on the planet. What do you mean you like black people? It's like you think we are all the same. For Jews, it's the same situation. Whether you use love or hate, you still put us all together in the same basket. You still think our Jewishness is the defining attribute rather than our choices as people. You love Jews? I don't even love Jews. I've known too many of us who are assholes. People are people. But Brando couldn't get it. He actually repeats the same trope years later, in his autobiography. He couldn't get it. And he couldn't get it, not because he was bad, not because he was evil, he was a kind person, but because it is an inseparable part of the culture in which he grew up. In the West, that's how they think, that's how they speak. So even the non-racists, even people who speak out against racism, can't help themselves when it comes to Jews. Think about it, it's in the scripture, it's in plays, it's in movies, it's in books, it's even in the language. A con artist or a greedy bastard is a Shylock, the character from The Merchant of Venice. A group of conspirators is a cabal, which is taken from the Hebrew word for Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah. And Brando wasn't alone in this. Speaking of Lord of the Rings, Tolkien said that he based his dwarves on the Jews. Now again, he didn't mean it in a mean way, even though he was Catholic. He was inspired by Zionism, even though it was decades before Israel was even born. That was his metaphor for the Jewish nationalist movement. The dwarves want to go back to their home, which was stolen from them by a dragon, and they end up defeating the dragon and reclaiming their home. So again, the intent isn't negative. And in his own words, Tolkien describes Jews as hardworking fighters and innovators. But of course, all of the tropes are still there. The dwarves are depicted as ugly, big-nosed, and as brutish, simple, greedy, and gluttonous, and in need of the guidance from the kind Westerners. And what is the thing that drives them to their home? The gold and diamonds that the dragon had stolen from them. So once again, we see a Westerner who wasn't really anti-Semitic and actually in his mind was portraying Jews in a positive way, but he failed to see that he was using offensive stereotypes. Why? Because Westerners believe those stereotypes so deeply, they think they're true. And they think that Jews are aware of them and aware that they are true. So they don't view it as an offense. The same thing happened with Dickens and his portrayal of Fagin in the novel Oliver Twist. When there was outrage from the Jewish community, Dickens was stunned. He couldn't understand why they were so upset with him. Even though his character Fagin is an absolute horror in the book, taking advantage of the boys and abusing them for his own gain, and throughout the novel, Dickens almost always refers to him simply as the Jew. And he couldn't understand why people were upset. He thought his portrayal was quite reasonable. And that's what I mean when I say it's embedded into their culture. It's part of it. It's so inseparable from their culture that most of them don't even see it. Anti-Semitism is seamlessly embedded into Western culture. So yeah, your friend from school, your colleague from work, even those who are supporters of Israel, they probably believe at least some of the tropes to some extent. It's in their culture. And that is why our first step is to awaken them to the truth. Red pill them about their culture and about their anti-Semitism. So that the people who don't want to be racist realize what they're doing, what they're saying, what they believe in, and we can maybe start pushing for a change. Now, I never ask people to subscribe or share and all that crap, but I do have several videos about this topic, links in the description. And if you want to gently wake up the Gentiles, feel free to share these with them.